Okay, picture this. You're texting with your ex. It's not your favorite, but you do have a kid together. But then he starts telling you about dinner last night, and you start to get nervous. And then your stomach literally drops because your ex held your 8-year-old hostage at the dinner table for 13 hours because she didn't what? You guessed it, eat her Brussels sprouts. Hi, hello, and welcome to another episode of True Crime Culinary, the show where we explore the strange intersection of food history and true crime. This week's episode actually started because of a conversation at work. I was super excitedly telling my coworkers about something I learned in the hamburger episode, and then I realized I was kind of talking to like two vegetarians and, maybe not my target audience, but one of my coworkers casually asked, "So where do Brussels sprouts come from?" And I love a "hey, wait a minute" moment. I live for them. My heart goes pitter-patter as I go searching for answers. And then I go searching for crimes. And this time I was like, damn. The opening story is absolutely filled with red flags, to say the least. Normally I stay away from kid crime stories, but I had to share what I know many others have experienced. Fortunately not me, I was spared. But I feel like I've heard about previous generations that have this weird obsession with making other people eat these boiled slimy fart pellets. Because I had to eat them, now you have to eat them. And we're going to hear more about that family trio, Toot Sweet. But just to kick things off, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cabbage, kale, cauliflower, collard greens, and kohlrabi are all the exact same species of plant. They're basically the farty dog breeds of the vegetable world, but nowadays you're more likely to see Brussels sprouts roasted and served with bacon. So what changed? Well, the answer involves medieval Belgium, evolutionary warfare, changing energy cost, aluminum, Pinterest, and a group of Dutch plant breeders who quietly fixed one of the most hated vegetables in America. So hold on to your tootin' butts and let's get rootin' into this melodious vegetable. Now, fortunately for cave dwellers everywhere, thousands of years ago, there were no Brussels sprouts, nor was there broccoli, cauliflower, or cabbage. There was just one wild coastal plant called Brassica oleracea. Oleracea? Which, by the way, sounds a bit like someone from Game of Thrones. But over generations, people kept choosing plants within Brassica oleracea. We're just going to call her Brassica. She's cool. People started choosing plants with the traits they liked. So some liked bigger leaves, some liked larger flower buds, some liked thicker stems, and eventually each became its own familiar vegetable. Brussels sprouts were actually one of the later inventions. And as I realized more and more while researching this show, there's usually a clue in the name. They're not the Sahara sprouts. So around the 13th century, farmers near Brussels, Belgium, began selecting cabbage plants that produced large edible side buds running up the stem instead of one giant head. And instead of harvesting one cabbage, you could harvest dozens of little baby cabbages. It was an efficient use of limited farmland around a rapidly growing city. So eventually, the vegetable took the city's name, Brussels, and became Brussels sprouts. Here's something else I didn't know. People often say all members of the Brassica fam are bitter. And I feel like especially kids can relate. I was a kid once. Well, there are actually two reasons for that. First, adults generally become more accepting of bitter flavors as we get older. Think of like coffee, dark chocolate, beer. And a lot of us grow into those. But there's a second reason, which is that Brussels sprouts aren't bitter by accident. Plants can't run away from insects, famously. Which kind of immediately made me think of one of the Star Trek movies where Spock says they can't fight and they can't flee, so they have to attack from within. And Brussels sprouts apparently got the same memo. They don't have legs, no claws, and no teeth. They just have chemistry. So many brassicas evolved chemical defenses called, we're in the forgiveness center, glucosinolates. So when an insect chews into the leaves or buds, those compounds break down into chemicals that taste bitter and unpleasant. And it's basically the plant yelling, "Buddy, I'm gonna need you to yeet yourself out of my personal space." And humans just happen to taste those same chemicals. So for hundreds of years, Brussels sprouts were optimized to survive bugs, not dinner. And I'm sitting here reading through this and I'm like, okay, totes fair. We all share this planet. Of course, we'd have something in common with the insect fam. But I also swear every story I've ever heard about older generations describing Brussels sprouts, they're like described as wet, slimy, gray, basically little cabbage grenades, whereas all I know today is you go to any restaurant and Brussels sprouts tend to be roasted, crispy, have some bacon, maybe some Parmesan, definitely not wet. So I was like, what happened there? Why did previous generations boil Brussels sprouts? And as it turns out, there's an answer. In fact, there's a few answers. It's kind of a bunch of little historical shifts that all came together. First, for much of history, fuel was expensive. Heating a big oven wasn't as simple as turning a dial to 425 degrees because you might have to chop down a tree. Well, first you had to have an axe, then you had to have a tree that you could chop down. Then you had to chop that tree into pieces, store the wood, or buy. So boiling vegetables on the stovetop used a lot less fuel than having to basically heat a whole oven and also get the temperature even and all that jazz. Stove was way more predictable. It wasn't necessarily about making something delicious, it was making it edible reliably. Then by the mid-1900s, things started changing. Gas and electric stoves became common, as did home freezers. So suddenly frozen vegetables, filled grocery stores were considered chic and cutting edge. And nutrition also became a major public health focus, which I love for us. But executionally, there was maybe a few areas for improvement. Because the message wasn't make vegetables delicious, the message was eat your damn vegetables. So cookbooks emphasized convenience, reliability, tenderness, and food safety, which I think we can all relate to with the current explosive diarrhea fear around uncooked, well, I guess I should say like fresh produce. I think raspberries and like spinach are on the list. I may or may not have 3 containers of raspberries in my refrigerator, and I'm pretty sure I'm gonna have to make jam if I want to eat them. And I'm just gonna stare at them. But back to overall food safety. In the mid-1900s, again, people wanted things to be safe. So frozen Brussels sprouts were often designed to go straight into boiling water because boiling water reliably killed unwanted little friends. But unfortunately, boiling also released a lot of sulfur compounds. So generations of children grew up eating gray, mushy vegetables that smelled like they had absolutely given up on life. I mean, can you imagine? And as I say that, I realize I bet a bunch of you can, and I'm very sorry. I hope you don't have PBSD. Post-Brussels sprout disorder. I think I'm hilarious. If you have a PBSD story, please write me at truecrimeculinary@gmail.com. I would love to read it and empathize with you. Sympathize? Empathize. Either way. But okay, there's one more piece of this story that I find kind of interesting, especially as somebody who worked in a restaurant. Apart from all the things we just went through, metal now enters the chat. Can you guess which one? The Brits yell aluminium, the Americans yell aluminum, and both of you are right because you're saying the same thing. Today, we barely think about aluminum, but in the early 1800s, it was actually considered more valuable than gold because nobody had figured out how to produce it efficiently. It was so valuable that Emperor Napoleon III reportedly served aluminum cutlery for his most honored guests, while everyone else had to settle for gold. The horror. And the capstone of the Washington Monument was made from aluminum because it was considered an incredibly prestigious metal, which is super wild to me. So then in 1886, everything changed. 2 inventors working independently developed what became known as the Hall-Héroult process, making aluminum dramatically cheaper to produce. So suddenly this luxury metal started showing up everywhere, including kitchens. Eventually, lightweight aluminum baking sheets became affordable for ordinary households. Commercial bakeries standardized pan sizes. Home kitchens adopted them too. So for decades, they mostly baked cookies, but eventually someone was like, hey, what if I put a vegetable on this? So by the 1990s and the early 2000s, chefs had begun rediscovering something wonderfully obvious. High heat makes vegetables taste amazeballs. Instead of boiling Brussels sprouts, they roasted them, the edges browned, natural sugars caramelized, nutty flavors developed. And instead of smelling like sulfur, aka ass, they smelled incroyable. And around the same time, gastropubs started popping up. And yes, I did have to Google gastropub. I was like, what do you mean gastropub? Like, pubs have snacks. What does gastropub mean? And it basically is a pub that decided to hire a really good chef. And so instead of frozen appetizers and greasy bar food, these gastropubs started serving elevated comfort food, and Brussels sprouts fit right in. They suddenly appeared roasted with bacon, Parmesan, balsamic glaze, maple syrup, My personal favorite also includes chili flakes. And people voluntarily, indeed voluntarily, ordered Brussels sprouts as an appetizer. What a time to live. Then also Pinterest and food blogs exploded, and now sheet pan dinners became one of the easiest weeknight meals imaginable. Toss everything with a little bit of olive oil, spread it out on a baking sheet, roast, and done. And then somehow the vegetable that had traumatized an entire generation suddenly became super trendy. And as someone who worked in restaurants and has a chef mom, sheet pans have kind of just always existed in my world. They're everywhere, they're cheap, they stack, they fit ovens perfectly, and they're easy, I would say medium easy to clean. So it never actually occurred to me that that was a new thing, but it makes a ton of sense. So we understand the cooking makes a difference. The age of ourselves make a difference. The Belgians make a difference. But it doesn't explain everything, because I swear years ago, while trapped on a plane, I watched a documentary that claimed Brussels sprouts themselves had changed. And it turns out that documentary was right. In the 1990s, Dutch plant breeders discovered older Brussels sprouts naturally contained lower levels of bitter compounds. Now, I don't mean literally, like 1,000-year-old Brussels sprout. I mean the varieties. I guess they must have had seeds. Now, I should have looked that up. How did they get them? Okay, presumably seeds. We're going to run with that one. They bred them and they're like, hey, these taste a lot better. And so, not using genetic modification, but instead traditional crossbreeding, they gradually introduced these sweeter, less bitter varieties, and people bought them more. So we're not imagining something. The taste of Brussels sprouts did change alongside the way that we cook them. And as if the Dutch breeders weren't already doing Brussels sprouts enough favors, Mother Nature also likes to give us a little pat on the butt. Because one thing I learned that completely surprised me is that many growers actually like harvesting Brussels sprouts after the first frost. Now, I grew up in California, and so I always assumed that sunshine makes everything taste better. But apparently, Brussels sprouts say nay nay. Because when temperatures drop, the plant begins converting more of its stored starches into sugars to help protect itself from freezing, which is super cool. And so it's basically putting on a little winter coat. And then the result is sweeter sprouts. Speaking of sweeter, remember that poor mom from the beginning of the episode? The one reading those absolutely unhinged and the alarming text messages from her ex? Because this guy did not just insist that his daughter eat her vegetables. He literally refused to let her leave the dinner table for 13 hours. She wasn't allowed to sleep. She wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom. She had to sit there until she ate her Brussels sprouts. At some point, after 13 hours, she did eat the Brussels sprouts, which I can only imagine were cold and slimy, regardless of whether or not they were baked. And just why would you do that to somebody? But let's just rejoice in the fact that this kid had a mom that had her back. And a judge, for that matter. Quote from the judge, "You do not deprive a child of sleep for an entire night or forbid them from going to the bathroom. And we do not let an 8-year-old child sit for hours in soiled clothing. When we do so, we violate their integrity and dignity. And now it is his turn to suffer the consequences of his actions." The father was convicted and sentenced for abusing his daughter, and thankfully, she got to go home with someone who understood that there are far better ways to encourage a child to try new foods. So if you're staring into the fridge at some round Brussels sprouts, may I just recommend skip the boiling and definitely skip the hostage situation. Swap the boiling for baking and maybe add bacon parmesan and a little bit of chili flakes. Until next time, stay curious and be careful what's in your cup. Check out our show notes for sources, hit that subscribe button, rate and review the podcast anywhere you listen.